Welcome everybody to a look at another film from Warner Brothers Archive Collection, and it is 1978's The Swarm. So this is directed by Irwin Allen, who also directed Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, which was the last film he would direct, as well as also Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which is the only other directorial film I've seen from him outside of Beyond the Poseidon Adventure and The Swarm. But he's most well known as a producer, as he also produced the likes of The Poseidon Adventure, The Towering Inferno, and several TV movie disaster films like Flood, Fire, Cave In, and The Night the Bridge Fell Down, which, yeah, are not great, but I do really rather like their kind of like direct and to the point titles. Fire, Flood. You're not gonna presume it's gonna be a period drama with that title. So yeah, and this is a natural horror film that is a disaster film adjacent. There were a lot of films in the 70s that had disaster film elements to them. Like Juggernaut or 2 Minute Warning or Black Sunday, but were more in another genre. They just had disaster elements to it, and then this is one of those. Clocks in at 155 minutes long. There was a shorter theatrical cut at 116 minutes, but we only get the longer version here. And since the cast in this, like typically with a lot of disaster films from the 70s, is vast, I'm only going to mention either the disaster film, other disaster films that they were in, or just the actor themselves if they weren't in one at all. So, Michael Caine was also in Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. Catherine Ross was in Voyage of the Damned. Richard Widmark was in Roller Coaster, which is another one of those disaster adjacent films. Richard Chamberlain was in The Towering Inferno. Olivia de Havilland was in Airport 77. Also saw Ben Johnson, and then we've got Lee Grant, who was also in Voyage of the Damned and Airport 77. Then we've got Jose Ferreira, who was in Voyage of the Damned. Patty Duke was in Fire. Slim Pickens was also in Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. Then we've got Bradford Dillman. Then Fred McMurray was in technically an early disaster film or adjacent disaster film because he was in Fair Wind to Java, which a massive part of that film is about Krakatoa exploding. So yeah, that's a really rather good one. And then we've got Henry Fonda, who is in Roller Coaster, City on Fire, and Meteor. And finally, Cameron Mitchell, who is in Flood. So, scientist Dr. Bradford Crane and Army General Thaddeus Slater join forces to fight an almost invisible enemy threatening America. Killer bees that have deadly venom and attack without reason. So, given its reputation and the hand it had in killing off the disaster film craze of the 70s, although it wasn't alone in that, because Beyond the Poseidon Adventure was also a massive flop and not particularly great. But the real killer was When Time Ran Out, which was an even bigger flop than either of these, and yeah, was also a pretty trash film, quite frankly. So yeah, I expected worse, but certainly wanted better, and but this was I was expecting worse, but I certainly got better than what I was expecting. And despite getting some entertainment from it, however, the numerous flaws are indisputable. The cast so good in other films is either underwhelming or underused. For instance, three of our main lead cast get killed off in the same disaster scene, so yeah, we're gonna lose them fairly immediately. While their whole like love triangle element just feels unresolved, so that's a bit of a shame. It is also far too long. The characters aren't well established or properly developed. The plot premise is ridiculous while being played too seriously to be wholly entertaining. The pacing is all over the place because you have a really rather solid first 20 or so minutes and then kind of slows down, then it speeds up again when a disaster starts to happen and such and such. Um, and the script doesn't even manage to be average, quite frankly, as it just plays it really rather seriously, but also by the numbers. Here's a certain character. What do they do? What can they help with? Blah blah blah. So yeah, but despite all of those negatives, though, I still found it to be mostly engrossing. The opening during the credits is nicely done, as it's completely wordless. You're following these people with hazmat suits on and guns that are entering this base, and there's people dead, and there's machines still whirring away, and you have no idea what's gone on. There is some good camera work. The production is solid. The score is decent, and the practical effects are still convincing, and there are some really rather effective set pieces. I also like some of the miniatures that are involved as well, like a train crash. There's a nuclear plant that blows up. So there are some elements like that that are worthwhile, but unfortunately, I just wish it was shorter so those elements could, feel, more frequent. Whereas otherwise, with this running time, they just feel really rather far apart. Wish it was also more focused. less grim in its tone and played up the ridiculousness of its plot rather than trying to be serious. That's the main point with this film. It's one of those numerous 70s disaster films that are way too serious for their own good. Now, granted, films like Earthquake and Towering Inferno and Poseidon Adventure, you can understand why they would be serious because they are kind of films that are based in reality to some degree. You know, we've had plenty of ship disasters, we've had buildings burning down, and we've obviously had plenty of earthquakes, but this is highly unlikely to ever happen. So I personally would have gone for a much more B movie, 1950s sci-fi horror kind of tone. You know, a bit campy, playing up the characterizations and such like that. But it plays it far too seriously. For instance, Michael Caine and Richard Widmark are shouting at each other more often than not when they're together. And the only times they seem to ever quieten down is when Catherine Ross comes into the scene. So, yeah, it's just far too serious for its own good, quite frankly. So, yeah, that's ultimately what holds it back. So, I'm only going to give it 2.5 out of 5. Not the worst disaster film from this period. I would say When Time Ran Out was worse than this. Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, even though I think I've given that the same rating, is also slightly worse than this, despite being a lot shorter. But I think that's mainly the reason why I hate that film more is purely because it's nowhere near as good as the original. But still, yeah, not a particularly great film, and I can certainly see why audiences didn't take to it, quite frankly. So, yeah, we've got a couple of extras on this film. We've got a behind-the-scenes documentary, Inside the Swarm, and then a theatrical trailer. The Blu-ray itself looks fine, but nothing spectacular. So there is that. So yeah, on the whole, not a great film, but because it is a disaster film, and I am a massive fan of the genre, despite several films being quite flawed, it's one of those genres that I will, especially from the like 70s, that I will buy time and time again, regardless of quality. So yeah, which is also exemplified by the fact I have the Airport series, which only really has two, maybe 2.5 films that are any good in that one. So yeah, but still well worth watching just for the cast and the fact that it's considered one of the worst films ever made, which I personally don't think is the case. Nonetheless, so thank you for watching. If you have seen this film before, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.